July 7, 1968, 2:47 a.m. Wells Restaurant, Harlem. Bumpy Johnson collapsed face-first into his breakfast plate. The king of Harlem was dead before he hit the table. And standing in the back of that restaurant, watching the chaos unfold, was a 38-year-old driver named Frank Lucas. In the next 72 hours, every gangster, every Italian crew, every corrupt cop in New York would come for Bumpy's throne. But Frank Lucas wasn't just Bumpy's driver. He was Bumpy's student. And what Frank did next wouldn't just fill the power vacuum. It would rewrite the entire game. This is the story of how Frank Lucas took everything Bumpy Johnson taught him and built something even Bumpy never imagined. To understand what happened after Bumpy died, you need to understand what happened before. You need to understand the relationship between the teacher and the student. The king and the man who would surpass him. 1946. Frank Lucas was 16 years old when he arrived in Harlem from Greensboro, North Carolina. He'd left the South after watching the Ku Klux Klan murder his cousin in broad daylight. Frank learned something that day that would shape everything that came after. The law doesn't protect you. Power does. Frank arrived in New York with $20 in his pocket and rage in his heart. He didn't want to be a hustler. He wanted to be invisible, untouchable, the kind of man who could walk through hell and never get burned. But first, he needed to survive. He started small. Numbers running for a local operation on 116th Street. Delivering packages. Collecting debts. The work was dangerous, low-paying, and Frank was good at it because he understood something most street hustlers didn't. Business is about patterns. Learn the pattern, control the pattern, own the pattern. 1957. 11 years later, Frank was still grinding. Still collecting. Still invisible. That's when Bumpy Johnson noticed him. Bumpy was 57 then, gray-haired, sharp-dressed, the undisputed king of Harlem. He controlled the numbers racket, the policy banks, the protection systems. He'd survived Dutch Schultz, made deals with Lucky Luciano, spent time in Alcatraz, and came back stronger. Bumpy Johnson was a legend. And legends don't waste time on nobodies. Except Frank Lucas wasn't a nobody. One Tuesday afternoon, Bumpy was leaving Small's Paradise when 3 Italian soldiers from the Genovese family stepped out of a Cadillac. They wanted tribute. Protection money. The kind of shakedown that ended with broken bones or dead bodies. Frank was across the street, picking up an envelope from a policy bank. He saw the Italians surround Bumpy. Saw the tension. Saw the guns bulging under their jackets. Most people would have walked away. Minded their business. Stayed alive. Frank Lucas walked directly toward them. Mr. Johnson, Frank said calmly, positioning himself between Bumpy and the lead Italian. Your car's ready. The Italians looked at Frank like he was an insect. One of them, a thick-necked enforcer named Sal, grabbed Frank's shoulder. You got a death wish, boy? Frank didn't move. Didn't flinch. Just looked Sal in the eye. You touch Mr. Johnson, you're starting a war you can't win. You touch me, you're disrespecting Mr. Johnson. Either way, you lose. So take your hand off my shoulder before you make a mistake. Bumpy said nothing. Just watched. Waiting to see what Frank would do. Sal's hand tightened. Then Bumpy spoke. Let him go. The Italians looked at Bumpy, then at Frank, then back at Bumpy. We'll be back, Sal said. No, you won't, Bumpy replied quietly. Because I'm going to talk to your boss, and he's going to explain to you why Harlem isn't your territory. Now get out of my neighborhood. The Italians left. And Bumpy turned to Frank. What's your name? Frank Lucas, sir. You got balls, Frank. Or you're stupid. I haven't decided which yet. Neither, Mr. Johnson. I just know how business works. They were testing you. If you backed down, every crew in New York would try the same thing. So I made sure you didn't have to back down. Bumpy smiled. It was the first time Frank had seen that smile. The one that said, "I'm impressed, but don't get cocky. You work for Mickey Cohen's crew, right?" "Yes, sir." "Not anymore. You work for me now." That was the beginning. For the next 11 years, Frank Lucas became Bumpy Johnson's shadow. His driver, his enforcer, his student. Bumpy didn't just teach Frank the streets. He taught him the game. Lesson 1, stay invisible. Bumpy drove a modest Buick. Wore nice suits, but not flashy. Never drew attention. Frank watched and learned. Power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. Lesson 2, respect the community. When Harlem families couldn't pay rent, Bumpy paid it. When kids needed school supplies, Bumpy provided them. When the police harassed black businesses, Bumpy made phone calls that made the harassment stop. Frank watched and learned. You can't rule through fear alone. You need loyalty. Lesson 3, the Italians aren't your enemy. They're your competition. Bumpy had deals with the 5 families. He paid tribute, but he kept Harlem independent. He understood the balance. Push too hard, you start a war. Push too soft, you lose respect. Frank watched and learned. Business is chess, not checkers. Lesson 4, control the supply, not the street. Bumpy understood infrastructure. He ran the numbers game, the policy banks, the legitimate fronts. He controlled the money flow, not the product itself. Frank watched and learned. Distance equals survival. But there was one lesson Bumpy never taught Frank. One lesson Frank would have to learn on his own. The world changes. And if you don't change with it, you die. July 7, 1968. 2:47 a.m. Wells Restaurant. Bumpy Johnson was eating breakfast with 2 city councilmen and Frank. They were discussing a new housing project in Sugar Hill, talking about investment opportunities, about keeping Harlem's money in Harlem's hands. Bumpy was mid-sentence when he stopped. His hand went to his chest. His face went pale. "Bumpy?" Frank stood up. Bumpy tried to speak, but no words came. He collapsed forward, face hitting his breakfast plate. Eggs and toast scattered across the table. Frank was there in seconds, checking Bumpy's pulse. Nothing. "Call an ambulance," Frank shouted. But he already knew. Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd survived prison, gang wars, the Italian mob, and 40 years in the streets, was dead from a heart attack at 62 years old. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later. By then, word was already spreading through Harlem like wildfire. Bumpy's dead. The king is gone. Who's taking over? By sunrise, every major player in New York's underworld knew. And by noon, they were moving. The Genovese family sent representatives to Bumpy's policy banks. The message was simple: Bumpy's deal died with him. You work for us now, or you don't work. Other Harlem hustlers, guys who'd been waiting in Bumpy's shadow for years, started making moves. Trying to grab territory, trying to claim they were Bumpy's rightful heirs. The police, the ones on Bumpy's payroll, started calling around. Who's paying us now? Because if nobody's paying, we're shutting everything down. It was chaos. A kingdom without a king. A power vacuum that would either be filled quickly or tear Harlem apart. And Frank Lucas? He disappeared. For 48 hours, nobody saw him. Not at Bumpy's funeral. Not at the policy banks. Not at Small's Paradise. Frank Lucas vanished like smoke. People thought he was scared. Thought he was running. Thought he was just another soldier who couldn't handle the pressure. They were wrong. Frank Lucas was planning. July 10, 1968. Frank called a meeting. Not at Small's Paradise, not at any of Bumpy's old spots. At a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn. Neutral territory. He invited 15 people. Bumpy's top lieutenants, his policy bank operators, his most trusted collectors. The people who actually ran Harlem's underworld while Bumpy played chess with the politicians. They showed up because Frank had asked. Because Frank had been Bumpy's right hand. Because they wanted to know what the plan was. What they didn't expect was what Frank said first. Bumpy's system is dead. Silence. Absolute silence. An older operator named Jimmy Junebug Walker stood up. Junebug had been with Bumpy since 1952. Excuse me? Bumpy built this. Bumpy protected U.S. And you're saying? I'm saying the world changed, Frank interrupted. And Bumpy didn't. The Italians control the supply chains. They control the distribution. They control the price. And we pay them tribute to operate in our own neighborhood. That ends now. You think you're going to go to war with the 5 families? Junebug laughed. You're out of your mind, Frank. I'm not going to war with them, Frank said calmly. I'm going to make them irrelevant. He opened a briefcase on the table. Inside were documents. Airline tickets. Bank statements. Next week, I'm flying to Bangkok, Thailand. I'm going to meet with suppliers directly. I'm cutting out the middleman. No Italians. No tribute. No markup. We buy directly at source price, we handle our own distribution, we keep 100% of the profit. The room erupted. That's insane. The Italians will kill you. You're starting a war. Frank raised his hand. The room quieted. The Italians won't kill me. Because by the time they figure out what I'm doing, I'll already control the market. I'll have better supply lines at half their cost. And when their operations start bleeding money, when their dealers switch sides, when their profit margins disappear, they won't be able to stop it. They'll have to negotiate. And when they do, we negotiate from strength, not weakness. Junebug shook his head. Bumpy would never. Bumpy's dead, Frank said, and his voice was cold now. Bumpy was a great man. Bumpy taught me everything. But Bumpy's way was the old way. Respect the Italians. Pay tribute. Stay in your lane. That worked for 30 years. But times changed. The business changed. The money changed. And if we don't change, someone else will, and we'll be working for them. He looked around the room. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what's happening. You can come with me, or you can stay behind. But Harlem's not going back to the old way. Not ever. One by one, they made their choices. Some walked out. Some stayed. By the end of the meeting, Frank had 8 people committed. 8 people willing to bet everything on Frank Lucas's vision. It was enough. 2 weeks later, Frank Lucas landed in Bangkok, Thailand. He didn't go alone. He brought a former U.S. Army sergeant named Leslie Ike Atkinson, a man who'd made connections in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. Ike knew people. People who controlled supply chains. People who ran distribution networks that the Italians had never even heard of. Frank met with them in a warehouse outside Bangkok. No translators. No intermediaries. Just Frank, Ike, and 3 Thai businessmen. How much can you move? Frank asked. Large quantities. More than you've probably handled before. I need regular shipments. Monthly. Can you do it? The suppliers looked at each other. That was a massive commitment. Bigger than anything they'd done with American operators. Price, one of them asked. Frank quoted a number that was 1/5 of what the Italians were charging in New York after it passed through 3 middlemen. And transport, the supplier asked. Frank smiled. I'll handle that. That's when Frank revealed his masterpiece. His system. The thing that would make him untouchable for the next 7 years. You know the U.S. military ships dead soldiers back from Vietnam, right? Frank said. The supplier nodded. Those bodies come back in coffins. Metal coffins. Sealed. draped with American flags. And nobody, I mean nobody, checks inside. It's disrespectful. It's sacred. And it's the perfect transport route. Frank Lucas had cracked the code. He would use military transport channels that nobody dared to inspect. The coffins would fly from Thailand to Dover Air Force Base, Delaware. From there, Frank's people would collect them and drive them to New York. It was genius. It was ruthless. And it worked. October 1968. The first shipment arrived. Frank's operation was running. And within months, he'd built a distribution network that made the Italian operations look outdated and expensive. The Italian dealers panicked. They tried to adjust their prices, but they couldn't compete. Their costs were too high. Their supply chains were too slow. Dealers started switching sides. Customers demanded better quality at lower prices. And Frank Lucas, the invisible driver who nobody had paid attention to, became the biggest operator in New York. By 1969, Frank was making more money than he'd ever imagined. More money than Bumpy had ever made. More money than the 5 families combined were making in Harlem. He bought a mansion in Teaneck, New Jersey. He drove a Mercedes. He dressed in custom suits. And slowly, without realizing it, Frank Lucas forgot the most important lesson Bumpy Johnson ever taught him. Stay invisible. 1971. Frank Lucas made the mistake that would cost him everything. March 8, 1971. Madison Square Garden. Muhammad Ali vs. Joe Frazier. The fight of the century. And Frank Lucas, sitting in the front row, wearing a $100,000 chinchilla fur coat. The cameras panned the crowd. They caught Frank. And in a DEA office in Lower Manhattan, a detective named Richie Roberts saw the footage. "Who is that?" Roberts asked. Nobody knew. Frank Lucas had stayed so far off the radar that even the DEA didn't have a file on him. But now they did. Roberts started digging. Teaneck Mansion. Mercedes. Cash businesses. No visible income source. And slowly, piece by piece, Richie Roberts built a case. It took 4 years. But on January 28, 1975, 200 DEA agents surrounded Frank Lucas's mansion in Teaneck, New Jersey. Frank didn't run. He sat down at his kitchen table, poured himself coffee, and waited. When Richie Roberts walked in, Frank looked up and smiled. "I was wondering when you'd get here." Roberts sat down across from him. "You built an empire, Frank. Smarter than the Italians. Cleaner than anyone I've ever seen. But you made one mistake." "The coat," Frank said quietly. "The coat." Frank nodded. "Bumpy told me. Stay invisible. I got arrogant. I thought I was untouchable." "You were," Roberts said. "Until you weren't." Frank Lucas was sentenced to 70 years in prison. But he didn't serve 70 years. Because Frank did something that shocked everyone. He cooperated. He gave up names. Corrupt cops. Mob connections. Over 100 arrests came from Frank Lucas's testimony. He walked out of prison in 1981 after serving just 5 years. But when Frank returned to Harlem, nobody shook his hand. Nobody looked him in the eye. He'd broken the code. The street code. The one rule even Bumpy Johnson couldn't bend. Never cooperate with the law. Frank Lucas lived to 88 years old. He died in 2019, alone in New Jersey. He'd built an empire bigger than Bumpy's. He'd made more money than Bumpy ever dreamed of. He'd revolutionized the entire game. But he'd lost the one thing Bumpy valued most. Respect. Bumpy Johnson taught Frank Lucas how to survive. How to think. How to build. But Bumpy also taught him one lesson Frank never truly learned until it was too late. Power without respect is just money, Frank. And money disappears. But respect? That's forever. Frank Lucas proved something the night Bumpy Johnson died. You can take your mentor's lessons and build something greater. You can innovate. You can evolve. You can surpass the master. But if you forget why the master earned respect in the first place, you'll lose everything that matters. Bumpy Johnson died a king. Frank Lucas died a ghost. If this story of ambition, innovation, and the price of betraying your code hit you, smash that subscribe button. Drop a like if you understand that some lessons can't be learned, they have to be lived. Share this with someone who needs to know that surpassing your mentor means nothing if you lose yourself in the process. What would you have done in Frank's position? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, respect isn't inherited. It's earned. Every single day.